A simple woman walked into a room filled with wealth, legacy, and sharpened smiles, and from the moment she stepped through those heavy oak doors, everything about her was wrong. Wrong dress, wrong bag, wrong silence. She didn't speak, didn't explain, didn't even blink as the storm of judgment formed around her. But what if the woman they mocked, ignored, humiliated, was the only one who actually belonged? Would you have treated her any differently? And what if someone was watching? From the very beginning, she arrived 3 minutes early, just as the morning mist began lifting off the hills that guarded the Thorn estate like loyal sentinels. The long driveway curved through hedges, trimmed too neatly, flanked by fountains and white statues of forgotten gods. Her car, a 12-year-old Honda with a chipped bumper, was parked respectfully far from the grand entrance. She walked the final stretch alone. Her dress was made of gray linen, unpressed but clean, falling in soft folds that whispered with each step. A cardigan of pale blue slipped slightly off one shoulder, exposing skin like quiet porcelain. Her shoes were flat, practical. Silent, the bag she carried was canvas, hand-stitched, unbranded, and obviously personal. There was no perfume trailing in her wake, no designer tags stitched into her identity. When she stepped into the grand hall, she did not announce herself. She simply entered. The space seemed to inhale around her, a slow, collective breath of confusion, dismissal, and judgment. Chandeliers hung overhead like frozen storms, throwing fractured light over polished oak floors and velvet upholstery. The air smelled of old money, waxed wood, champagne, leather, and roses arranged in crystal vases taller than most toddlers. The room was alive with chatter. People gathered for a single reason: Logan Alexander Thorn, missing and presumed dead, had left behind an empire. And today the key to that kingdom would be handed over. She moved to the back near a window that framed the hills. Her fingers tightened slightly on the strap of her bag. She didn't make eye contact. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. But the crowd? Oh, they noticed her. A man with a gold T.I. Preston Thorn, second cousin, once removed and twice entitled, squinted toward her, then barked a laugh. Is that the maid? Across the room, a woman in a crimson dress tilted her champagne flute and leaned into her sister. Or maybe one of his charity cases. The bag alone screams, Salvation Army. A cluster of cousins erupted in quiet laughter. Ivy Clark stood still. No reaction, no comeback. Just a quiet adjustment of her cardigan and a step closer to the window. Another woman, Claire Evans, a startup founder with more Instagram followers than IQ points, snapped a discreet photo, her manicured fingers flying across her phone. Found Logan's charity case crashing the will reading. She captioned it, Guess she thinks thrift store chic gets you $1 billion. Hashed Thorn will flop. The image went live in seconds. Phones buzzed with reactions. Likes laughed. Comments that boiled down to one collective idea. Who let the outsider in? Vivi's eyes glanced toward the screen, saw the post light up, then drifted back to the chair at the front of the room. The one left empty, the one reserved for the lawyer. She didn't flinch, but they kept going. Of course they did, Elise. Clara's shadow of a best friend chuckled. She doesn't even look embarrassed. Poor thing, probably doesn't know she's a meme now. More phones lifted, more pictures taken. Ivy became digital fodder, real-time ridicule in a room that was supposed to honor the dead. To them, she was nothing. To them, she was in the way. To them, she was disposable. But she didn't leave. In fact, her stillness became its own kind of defiance. A protest made in silence, a quiet resistance that unsettled something beneath their polished facades. Still, it wasn't enough to stop the performance. A man in a velvet blazer, Trevor Lang, heir to exactly nothing but arrogance, strolled behind Ivy and smirked. He scribbled something on a napkin and with theatrical sleight of hand tucked it into the strap of her bag. It read, Charity Case. The room buzzed. Eyes pointed. Hands covered mouths as if the joke were too sacred to speak aloud. Clara howled. Elise's phone clicked again. She's a walking punchline, someone whispered in Ivy. She didn't notice, didn't. Or maybe she did, but refused to acknowledge it. Preston poured another glass of champagne. Logan always had strays, but this one, she's embarrassing the family. Gerald Hayes, an investor who had lost more money than most people made in a lifetime, muttered to his wife, Logan would never let someone like her near this place. His wife, dripping in emeralds and contempt, agreed. It's disrespectful. She needs to go. A distant cousin called out, Sweetheart Kitchen's that way. The laughter now was no longer private. It was loud, public, unified. They had formed a wall, and Ivy stood on the outside. Then came Marissa Preston's sister, tall, poisonous, beautiful in a way that suggested plastic and pride. Her heels clicked like gunfire as she approached Ivy, closing the distance between predator and prey. "You're in the wrong place, darling," she said, loud enough for every eye to turn. Then she flicked Ivy's cardigan. The gesture was small, but surgical. A symbolic undressing. "This isn't a soup kitchen. Why don't you leave before you embarrass yourself further?" A slow murmur of agreement rippled through the room like a toxic wave. Not one person stepped in. Not one defended her. Ivy stood alone, shamed, not for anything she did, but for everything she was not. Still she didn't move. Still she didn't break. Still she didn't speak, but she did glance briefly at the security camera in the corner of the room. A red light blinked. It was live, no one noticed except her. Marissa turned on her heel, satisfied. The crowd buzzed louder, sipping champagne and ego in equal measure. And just then the doors opened again. Arthur Grayson entered, a man whose briefcase had carried the fate of generations. In his 60s, with a voice like gravel and eyes like steel, he walked straight to the table, opened his case, and pulled out a single sealed envelope. The room hushed. Everyone straightened. Everyone except Ivy. She was already ready. Grayson's eyes scanned the crowd, then paused just briefly on Ivy. It was only a second, but in that second, Preston frowned. "What was that?" he whispered. Gerald stood up, his voice louder than necessary. "This woman is a fraud. Logan would never leave his estate to someone like her." The crowd rallied behind the accusation. Agreement was instant. Loud, venomous, Grayson cleared his throat. "We are here to read the last will and testament of Logan Alexander Thorne, executed 3 years ago, verified and authenticated." A ripple moved through the room. 3 years ago, Logan had vanished only 6 months earlier, presumed dead after his private jet disappeared over the Pacific. No body, no wreckage, no closure. But they had all gathered here with one expectation: to be rewarded. None of them noticed that Ivy hadn't blinked once since Grayson entered. They were too busy watching the throne. They never saw the queen coming. The room had settled into a silence so thick it nearly swallowed sound. Only the faint hum of the chandelier lights and the distant tick of an antique clock punctuated the stillness. The will sat sealed on the mahogany table, untouched. For a breathless moment, every eye remained fixed on Arthur Grayson. Yet every thought in the room revolved around Ivy, who still stood at the back, unmoving. Arthur slid a letter opener across the envelope's edge, breaking the red wax with a soft snap that echoed louder than anyone expected. The sound cut through the tension like a blade, and several people shifted in their chairs. Clara looked down at her phone, her fingers twitching to refresh the hashtag she'd helped trend only 10 minutes ago. Her screen glowed, but no new likes were coming in. The joke was beginning to stale. No one laughed anymore. Arthur unfolded the paper with the kind of reverence reserved for declarations of war or sacred secrets. "This is the final and only valid testament of Logan Alexander Thorne," he began. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried with uncanny clarity. "To my family, colleagues, and associates," he read slowly, letting each word fall like a hammer. "I leave nothing, but this truth wealth reveals character, not worth." Several gasps broke through the tension unfiltered. Marissa clutched the back of her chair, her knuckles turning pale. Gerald's jaw dropped slightly. Preston blinked in disbelief. Clara's fingers froze. Elise whispered, "That can't be it," Arthur continued, unbothered. "All of Logan's assets, company shares, real estate holdings, investments, and intellectual properties are to be transferred in full to one individual, the one who stood by him with no expectation, the one who never asked what he owned, only who he was. His legal and rightful wife, Ivy." The name rang like a gong through the space, clean and devastating. They turned then, all of them, like marionettes yanked by the same string. Dozens of eyes locked on the woman in gray at the back of the hall. For a long beat, she didn't move. Preston was the first to speak, his voice breaking like a snapped violin string. "Wife Logan wasn't married. This is a mistake." Marissa stepped forward, her heels dragging slightly. "There was no wedding. No announcement. I would have known. Everyone would have known." Gerald slammed a hand on the table. "I want to see that document. I demand to see proof." Ivy remained still, but Arthur reached into his briefcase once more, calm as ever. He pulled out a folder, then laid it open across the table. Inside, a marriage certificate dated 7 years prior, signed and notarized. Alongside it, a stack of handwritten letters, bank statements, and photographs. He picked up one, Logan, smiling his arm around Ivy, standing on courthouse steps in front of a faded marriage license banner. Clara whispered, "That could be photoshopped." Arthur didn't respond. Instead, he connected a laptop to a small projector on the side table. A black screen blinked awake, then loaded with a video dated 7 years earlier. There they were, Logan and Ivy exchanging vows in a tiny civil ceremony. No guests, no extravagance. Just two people holding hands, looking into each other like nothing else existed. Elise's voice cracked. She was real this whole time. The room had no air left in it. Their assumptions collapsed like the pearl strands around Lillian's neck when she staggered backward and knocked into her own chair. But Ivy didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She simply stepped forward, slow and steady, her shoes still silent against the marble. It wasn't triumph in her expression. It was something older, more solemn, as if she knew how hollow revenge could feel. She stopped beside Arthur. He gave her a gentle nod and handed her the folder. Ivy opened it, glanced at the photo of her and Logan, then shut it again. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, but it didn't need to be loud. "I didn't come for the money," she said. "I came to see who would look past a cardigan and a quiet voice and remember the man you're here to honor, not the empire, not the stock portfolios. The man," she looked at Clara, "you never asked who I was, only what I wore." She turned to Marissa. "You dismissed me before I said a single word." Then to Preston, "You pointed to the kitchen, as if my place was behind a counter, not beside him." Preston's lips parted, but no sound came out. "You all failed," Ivy continued, "but not just a moral test. You failed Logan. You failed what little soul he left behind." The silence that followed was unbearable, until a small voice broke it. It came from the far end of the room. A soft cough, then a shuffle of movement. From a side door a man emerged, and the room broke open like a cracked mirror. Logan, alive, his face was thinner, his hair a touch more silver, but there was no mistaking the calm certainty in his posture or the cutting blue of his eyes. He walked with slow confidence, dressed not like a billionaire, but like a man who had lived elsewhere outside all this noise. Several people gasped aloud. Clara dropped her phone again. This time it cracked, or Marissa's mouth opened wide in disbelief, her carefully sculpted lips trembling. Gerald whispered, "No, no, that's not possible, Logan." Stopped beside Ivy, placing a hand gently at the small of her back. "She warned me," he said softly. His voice wasn't cold, it was final. "She told me if I disappeared, they'd come not to mourn, but to scavenge." He looked at Preston. "You called my wife a maid." He looked at Clara. "You turned her into content." He looked at Marissa. "You tried to have her thrown out." Each accusation landed like a sentence. No jury, no defense. Just truth. Logan's hand never left Ivy. "She designed this," he said. "Every detail, the will, the setup. Even the security footage. She wanted to see who would fail the test, and you all did." A slow motion descended over the room like fog rolling down from the hills. Then Ivy stepped forward again, her voice even. "I wore this cardigan on our 3rd anniversary. He loved it, said it made me look like the beginning of spring." She looked around, "But you saw something to mock, and that says more about you than it ever did about me." Arthur cleared his throat. Per Logan's instructions, any party who insulted or attempted to remove Mrs. Thorne during the reading shall be legally disqualified from inheritance. Effective immediately, he began reading names aloud. With each name, security moved gently but firmly, ushering people out. Clara tried to beg. Marissa threatened legal action. Preston called Logan delusional. No one listened. One by one, they were removed. The room grew quieter, emptier, until only a handful remained. A nurse, a groundskeeper, a retired librarian who had simply nodded to Ivy when she entered and offered her a seat. Logan turned to them with something like gratitude in his gaze. "You saw her," he said. That was all it took. Ivy looked out the window. The mist was gone. The hills glowed green under a silver light. And in the silence that followed, she exhaled for the first time all morning. The last of the names had been read. The doors clicked shut behind the final disgraced heir, and the great hall was suddenly cavernous in its stillness. A space that moments ago had been bloated with entitlement and echoing laughter now felt hollow, like a cathedral abandoned mid-sermon. Ivy remained beside Logan, her hands still loosely wrapped in his, though neither looked at each other. There was no need to. Everything that needed to be said between them had already been exchanged in glances and silence, in 7 years of hidden truths. The three people left in the room sat awkwardly in the back row. Sarah Ellis, the nurse from their wedding, now older and visibly emotional. Michael Reed, the librarian with gentle eyes who had once lent Logan a worn copy of The Count of Monte Cristo and remembered Ivy's name even after all these years. And Anna, the Thorne Estates head gardener, who had simply offered Ivy a glass of water before the ceremony began without asking who she was or why she was there. These three had not spoken during the chaos. They had not mocked or whispered or scrolled through social media. They had seen Ivy. Not just her clothes, not her bag, not her silence, but her presence, and that, as Logan had said, was all it took, Arthur. Grayson quietly began packing his briefcase, but Logan raised a hand. Wait. Everyone stilled again. Ivy, he said, turning to her slowly. Do you want to say it? Ivy looked at him for the first time since his reappearance. Her eyes, which had held back every emotion for over an hour now, shimmered. Not with tears, but with something else. Not pride, not vindication. Perhaps peace, she nodded once, then stepped forward again, turning not to the remaining three, but to the center of the room where the others had stood before being exiled by their own cruelty. There's something you all didn't know, she said softly, though her voice carried easily through the high ceilings and marble acoustics. Logan didn't disappear by accident. A pause, he chose to leave. A quiet shift of weight in the back row. Sarah's eyes widened just slightly. He was suffocating. Ivy continued. By obligations. By people who treated him as a wallet with legs. By the family that never asked if he was happy, only if he was profitable. The disappearance was our idea, but the test that was mine. She took a breath. See, after our marriage, Logan kept me out of the spotlight for a reason. He said he wanted something in his life that was real, untouched by headlines and agendas. He wanted a safe place to land. That's what we were to each other. A quiet harbor, but over the years I saw how many people circled him like sharks waiting for blood, waiting for death. I knew that if he ever truly vanished, they would feast. She turned toward the security camera mounted discreetly near the antique fireplace. Its red light still blinked, so we set the trap. The reaction from the three was subdued but reverent. No one dared speak yet. Ivy continued walking slowly along the table as she spoke. Logan drafted that will 3 years ago after the first stroke scare. Not because he thought he was dying, but because he realized no one around him knew him. They just knew the brand, the bank account, not the man who spent Sundays making pancakes and reading dog-eared sci-fi novels. Not the man who once cried over an injured sparrow on our porch. Not the man who married me in a borrowed suit with dirt still on his shoes. She paused, letting the picture settle in their minds. Today wasn't about legacy, it was about clarity. Logan stepped forward beside her, again placing a hand gently on the back of her neck. And now that we have it, he said, voice low, we can start again. But there was one final piece. Arthur Grayson cleared his throat softly, then spoke. There is an addendum. Everyone looked his way. This part was added recently, 3 months before Logan's disappearance. He unfolded a smaller envelope, cream-colored and sealed with a thinner line of wax. He read, to those who failed the test, you were never written out of my life. You wrote yourselves out. To those who remained, you remind me why I built this empire in the first place. But to Ivy, my North Star, my mirror, my only home, this is my final gift. Arthur looked up. Ivy, he left you something that was never part of the estate. Something private? She blinked, surprised. What? Arthur smiled just faintly. Come with me. They followed him down a side corridor away from the echoing chamber of the will reading, past tapestries and family portraits that seemed to watch them as they moved, down a spiral staircase through a door that required a passcode. Only Arthur and Logan knew. It was a studio, a hidden one, and it was filled with sketches, prototypes, models of devices and tools Ivy had never seen. Logan turned to her, sheepish and boyish, all at once. This was my real project, he said. Not the biotech, not the patents, this. She looked around wide-eyed. What is it? Solutions, he said, for the quiet problems no one funds. Tools for caretakers. Adaptive design for amputees. Communication devices for nonverbal children. All hidden from shareholders because it didn't make flashy profit margins. Ivy slowly approached a prototype, a wristband with tactile sensors small enough for a child's wrist, but complex enough to translate touch into simple spoken words. You did this? She whispered. With you in mind, he said. Remember the boy we met at the hospital in Kyoto? The one who wanted to tell his mother, "I love you," but couldn't. Her throat tightened. "I started this the week after." She turned to him overwhelmed. Logan continued, "You always told me we needed to build things that mattered, so I did. I just didn't show anyone. Until now." Arthur watched them with quiet approval. Sarah, Michael, and Anna remained respectfully at the door. Then Logan stepped back, gesturing at the room. "This is yours, Ivy, not just to inherit, but to lead." She stared at him, stunned. "I'm not a scientist." "No," he said, "but you see what others don't. You see people. That's what this needs." He turned to Arthur Draw. "Up the documents." Effective immediately, Ivy is not just the heir of the Thorn fortune. She's the CEO of Project Hearthlight. Her knees nearly gave, but Logan caught her. "Don't say you can't," he murmured. "You already did more than anyone in that room. You passed the only test that mattered." She didn't respond for a long time. Then finally she nodded. Not in agreement, in promise. Back upstairs, the great hall remained empty, save for a single chair. The one Ivy had once stood behind, silent and mocked. Now it sat under the light of a chandelier that no longer seemed cold. Dust danced in the sunbeam like tiny constellations. And for the first time in its long, gold-gilded life, the Thorn estate belonged to someone who had never asked for it, only proven she deserved it. How many times have we failed to see the worth in the quietest one in the room? And what would happen if next time we chose to listen instead of judge? In the weeks that followed the will reading, the Thorn estate transformed not physically, but atmospherically. The tension that once clung to its walls like mildew had lifted, replaced by a strange and almost unfamiliar quiet. Not the cold, brittle kind that filled the hall that day when Ivy first entered. This was different, warmer. Watchful, alive news of Logan's return spread like wildfire. The media swarmed for days. Headlines screamed everything from conspiracy theories to romantic redemption tales. Billionaire back from the dead. Wife in cardigan inherits everything. The Thorn deception, a moral test for the ages. Some outlets painted Logan as a manipulative recluse, others as a visionary Ivy. She was harder for them to label. Some called her a hero, others a schemer. Most just called her the simple woman in gray. But Ivy never answered the cameras. She never gave interviews. She didn't need to. The footage from that day, especially the moment she stepped forward, calm and quiet, and revealed her name, had already gone viral. Millions had seen the cruelty she endured, the restraint she showed, and the truth that shattered the room. Instead, Ivy stayed inside the estate within the sanctum of Logan's secret studio, now officially named Hearthlight Labs. Every morning she walked through its glass-paneled doors with a mug of tea and her cloth bag still stitched by hand. She spent hours listening to Logan explain the science behind each invention, watching with quiet wonder as pieces of technology revealed layers of human compassion. But Ivy's contribution was never technical. It was spiritual, emotional. She saw what these devices meant, who they were meant for. She insisted they not rush to market, that no design be finalized until it passed through one very human question. Would the person using this feel seen, not fixed? In the afternoon, she met with Sarah, Michael, and Anastassia, now dubbed the Three Who Stayed. Ivy had invited them to be part of a founding council for a new program, the Quiet Inheritances Initiative. The idea was simple and radical. The vast Thorn fortune would be split into two trusts, one for the continued development of Hearthlight's tech, and the other a silent fund dedicated to anonymous grants for individuals and communities who demonstrated unseen kindness. No press, no application, just observation, just presence, just goodness noticed in its natural state. They called it the Mirror Program because it was designed to reflect who people were when no one watched. Ivy didn't want to talk about legacy. She wanted to talk about character. But the world wouldn't let her disappear completely. It was Clara who tried first. 3 weeks after the reading, she sent a package to the estate. It was wrapped in expensive paper, sealed with faux wax, and carried a note inside, written in suspiciously poetic apology. "I was raised to believe in first impressions," it began. "Now I know the first one I gave you was the worst part of me. I'm sorry." Inside the package, a silk scarf, deep gray, nearly the same color as Ivy's original dress. Ivy stared at it for a moment, then handed it to Anna. "Donate this to the women's shelter in town," she said. "Someone might like it better for the color than the apology." Clara's attempt didn't end there. Days later, she showed up at the gates in a tailored pantsuit and oversized sunglasses. She held up a hand to the security camera, a silent plea for redemption, but the guard had instructions. No one gets in unless they made space for Ivy when she was invisible. The gates never opened. Preston tried to sue, claimed mental anguish, claimed manipulation. His lawyer even suggested Logan was under undue influence when he made Ivy sole heir. That backfired quickly when Logan released a series of recorded memos stored with his legal team and dated well before his disappearance, detailing every step of his decision-making process. "Preston doesn't deserve my time," one memo said plainly. "Let him sue. Let him exhaust himself, trying to reclaim what was never his to begin with." Marissa, for her part, vanished from public life altogether. Rumor had it she moved to the Amalfi Coast, started a candle brand, and hadn't spoken her brother's name since. The echo of her perfume, once so thick in the grand hall, was finally gone. But not everyone was bitter. As Hearthlight's work expanded quietly, letters began arriving, handwritten ones. A mother in Oslo who used one of their prototype communication bands for her nonverbal daughter. A retired nurse in Kansas who'd received one of the Mirror grants anonymously after being spotted helping an unhoused veteran. None of them knew Ivy, but they all knew of her. They wrote about dignity, about being seen, about how much it mattered that someone believed kindness could be rewarded. Not with applause, but with trust. And then one morning, Ivy received a letter unlike the rest. It was postmarked from Boston. Inside a photograph, faded, grainy, but unmistakable. It was Ivy, not recent, not posed. It had been taken long ago at a soup kitchen, back when she volunteered every Thursday. She remembered the moment she had just handed a man a bowl of stew and smiled. No makeup, no fanfare, just warmth. On the back of the photo, scribbled in loopy handwriting, "You were good before they knew your name. Thank you for not changing." No signature. Ivy didn't need one. That evening, she stood in the courtyard of the estate, dusk, wrapping the hills in lavender light. Logan approached quietly, the same way he always did, like he didn't want to disturb the air around her unless she welcomed him in. He placed a hand on her shoulder. "You've changed everything," he said. "No," she replied, watching a moth flirt with a garden lantern. "They just started looking." He smiled at that, tilting his head. "But you changed me." They stood there in silence, like roots and wind opposites, but essential to the same landscape. Then Logan turned to her with a look that held neither guilt nor gratitude, but a question. "Would you do it again?" he asked. "All of it, the plan, the pain, the waiting, the humiliation." Ivy thought for a long time. Then finally, "I wouldn't change the cardigan," she said with a smirk. He laughed. She continued, "I'd still walk into that room, still let them talk, still let them show me who they were." Her face softened, "Because now I know who I am." He reached into his coat and handed her a thin envelope. "What's this?" "The board meeting agenda," he said. "For tomorrow, I don't want a seat," she warned. "You know that?" "I know," he said. "But the chair with your name on it is already there. And the nameplate just says she saw us first." She smiled truly for the first time that day. The garden lights blinked on one by one along the gravel path. They didn't walk back inside immediately. They didn't need to. The house, once full of shadows and legacy, now simply felt like home and Ivy. The woman in the quiet flats and faded cardigan didn't just inherit a fortune, she inherited something much rarer. The right to decide what mattered. And for the first time in a long time, the world seemed ready to listen. How many empires were built without ever asking who they were hurting? And how many could be rebuilt if we just handed the blueprint to someone who knew how to listen? Spring deepened across the Thorne estate, and with it, a rhythm emerged, a quiet pulse beating beneath polished floors and ancient trees. The hills no longer watched in cold silence. They listened. The wind moved through ivy-covered walls like breath through lungs, carrying with it the echo of voices, new ones, real ones. Voices that had been silenced in boardrooms, dismissed at dinner parties, ignored in elevators, now filled the space Ivy had once stood alone in. The grand hall, once a theater of cruelty, had been reimagined. The ornate chairs were replaced with soft seating circles. The chandelier remained, but only because Ivy had insisted. "It's a reminder," she said, "that beauty can also bear witness to ugliness and endure." The long table where Grayson had read the will now held mugs, not champagne, and notebooks instead of shares. It was here that Ivy, Logan, and the quietly chosen few met every week to discuss not dividends, but decisions that rippled outwards. It had been 3 months since the reading. 3 months since Ivy stood at the back of the room and absorbed the hatred of an entire bloodline. Now she stood at the center, not for status, but because everyone naturally leaned in when she spoke. But something had shifted inside her. Something even Logan noticed. "You're not angry," he said one evening as they sat under the stars on the stone veranda, mugs of tea in hand. "Not even a little I was," she admitted. "But it was never them I was angry at." He tilted his head, confused. "I was angry at myself," she said, "for being surprised." She sipped her tea and let the weight of the words land. Surprised that people would laugh. Surprised that they'd assume I was less. Because I wore quiet things. I've seen this my whole life on buses, in shops, in schools. I thought being married to you would protect me from it. Logan's shoulders sank. She reached over and touched his hand. "But I don't want protection. I want awareness. And I want other women. Simple women to know that they don't have to armor themselves in wealth to matter." That became the guiding principle of the new project they launched together. Something even more radical than Hearthlight Labs or the Mirror program. They called it the Unseen Seat. Its mission was bold in simplicity: identify the person in every room who was overlooked and give them a voice, a vote, and a platform. Not because they were perfect, but because they were invisible. And in their invisibility, they had learned how to see. Ivy herself led the first initiative. She started with a quiet janitor named Ray, who had worked in Thorne's accounting building for 16 years without missing a single day. When asked what his biggest idea was, Ray hesitated, then laughed. "Well, I once redesigned a spreadsheet system that cut paper usage in half, but it wasn't my place to mention it. It became the new standard across all departments." Next came Ayana, a receptionist at a Thorne subsidiary in Nairobi, who had taught herself 5 programming languages on her lunch breaks. Her software prototype for inventory tracking saved the company nearly $3 million in its first quarter. Each of them was handed the seat, not a title, but a rotating position of influence, where they could suggest, decide, and direct. No corporate ladder, just open invitation. It worked, and it terrified people. The old board, what was left of it, began to push back. Not openly, those days were over, but subtly. Through whispers, through memo language, through uncomfortable silences when Ivy entered a room. They questioned her credentials, her background, her ability to lead an empire that in their eyes required aggression. She heard all of it and answered with data. Productivity was up, 19%. Employee turnover had dropped. Public favor surged. Social media dubbed Ivy the Velvet Architect, and while she disliked the title, she understood its usefulness. She let it stand. But not all battles could be won in the light. It was Preston who launched the smear campaign. Not with his name. He wasn't that foolish. But he funded a group of disgruntled former employees, once terminated after the will, reading for an anonymous blog site. It published stories designed to erode Ivy's credibility. She manipulated Logan during a mental breakdown. She was after the money all along. The will was rewritten under duress. They created AI-generated photos, forged emails, even faked voice recordings. And it worked for a while. The public turned uneasy. Shareholders grew nervous. Ivy didn't flinch, but Logan did. He wanted to retaliate, buy out media companies. Sue exposed Preston for the coward he was, but Ivy refused. "Don't fight shadows with fire," she said. "You just end up burning yourself." So she did something else. She called a press conference. The media expected fireworks, defensiveness, legal threats. What they got was a stage with one chair, and Ivy sitting in it. She wore the same cardigan, the same flats. She began with only one sentence. "Do you remember who I was before you Googled me?" She let the question sit, then she told the story. Not the Empire's story, hers. She told them about being underestimated her entire life, about walking into rooms where people assumed she was staff, or worse, invisible. She told them about choosing not to defend herself that day during the will reading, because she wanted to know who would defend her without being told to. She told them about the nurse, the librarian, and the gardener. She ended with a photo of Ayana standing on a podium beside Ray, holding a glass award that simply read, "We saw you, no anger." No drama, just truth. The public flipped. The campaign collapsed within 48 hours. It was Preston's name that was leaked to the press, not by Ivy, but by one of his own allies seeking immunity. He lost every board seat he still held. His name was scrubbed from family assets. But worse, he lost relevance. The one thing he'd clung to all his life. Ivy never mentioned his name again. Weeks later, she walked into the old Thorne boardroom. The plaque on the door had been changed. Instead of executive conference room, it now read, "The listening room." Inside each chair bore a small engraving. Not names, not titles, but phrases. She heard the silence. He gave kindness without cost. They showed up when it mattered. She stayed until the end. Ivy took her seat, no longer at the back, but not at the head either. Beside her sat Ayana. Across from her, Ray Michael, Sarah Anna, and Logan smiling, not leading. The room was full of people who once had no seat. Now they led the table. Ivy looked around, then down at her own chair's inscription. She hadn't seen it before. It read, "The one who watched, the one who waited, the one who knew." She exhaled deeply. Not tired, just full. Not victorious, but complete. Not angry, just ready. Because power, she realized, isn't about volume or wealth. It's about what you do when everyone finally stops talking. And Ivy, she'd been waiting a long time. How do you measure someone's worth? Is it their clothes, their words, their bank account, or is it something far quieter? Something that doesn't ask to be seen, but shows up anyway. Ivy didn't want the empire. She wanted truth, and in the end, she didn't inherit the thorn fortune. She rewrote what fortune meant forever.